The Rhine smelled of cold. Not the cold of a winter morning that retreats when the sun climbs. This was the cold of deep water, moving fast over stone, indifferent to everything that had happened on its shores in the 2,000 years since the Romans built their first fort on the western bank. Carl Timmerman had smelled a great many things in the 11 months since he had crossed the English Channel. He had smelled the Norman hedgerows burning in July, the Swedish rot of the Falaise pocket in August, the cold mud of the Siegfried line in autumn. But the Rhine was different. The Rhine smelled like the end of something. He was standing on a ridge above the valley on the morning of the 25th of February, 1945. The river moved below him, wide and dark, at a pace his engineer sergeant had measured at roughly 8 feet per second. Not as a warning, simply as a number that existed in the world and needed to be acknowledged. Timmerman had done the arithmetic without meaning to. A man swept off a pontoon bridge in that current would cover a quarter mile before anyone on the bank could do anything useful about it. He was 22 years old. He had been born in Frankfurt, Germany in the spring of 1922. His family had returned to America when he was still young enough that Germany existed in his memory primarily as a quality of light through apartment windows and the smell of his grandmother's kitchen. He had grown up in West Point, Nebraska, a town of 3,000 souls set in the flat agricultural country of the eastern state, the kind of place where a young man with no particular advantages could become, through stubbornness alone, whatever he decided to become. He had decided to become a soldier. He had enlisted in 1942, gone through officer candidate school, and arrived in England in the spring of 1944, with the reasonable confidence of a man who has been told repeatedly that he is ready for something he has not yet experienced. 11 months later, he knew the difference. 46 bridges. That was the number his battalion commander had given him 2 days earlier, reading from an intelligence summary with the flat affect of a man delivering facts he himself has not entirely absorbed. Of the 47 major bridges that had once spanned the Rhine, 46 had been destroyed by retreating German forces. Some blown at the last moment by engineers who stayed behind to fire the charges manually, knowing what staying behind meant. Some triggered automatically. Some brought down by Allied bombing as a secondary effect of attacks aimed at something else entirely. 46 bridges. The Rhine without its crossings was not simply a wide river. It was a military problem of the first order. The kind that, once stated plainly, produced a silence in planning rooms that lasted longer than it should. Eisenhower's staff had treated the Rhine crossing since 1943 not as a battle, but as an engineering project. Weeks of preparation, pontoon bridges, an airborne drop, the full weight of Allied industrial capacity applied to a single geographical obstacle. The main effort would come from the north. Montgomery's operation, designated Varsity, was scheduled for the 23rd of March. Everyone understood this. Everyone was waiting. Timmerman was not thinking about Montgomery. He was thinking about the 140 men behind him who had been his responsibility for exactly 16 hours, since the previous morning when his predecessor had been lifted off the field with shrapnel in both legs. He was thinking about his wet boots and 4 days without proper sleep and the particular quality of light on the water below, gray-green like old glass, moving with a heaviness that suggested depth. He did not know that 8 days earlier, in a hospital in West Point, Nebraska, his wife had given birth to a daughter. He did not know her name was Gay Diane. He would find out in Paris, weeks from now, reading a copy of Stars and Stripes in a cafe. He would sit with the newspaper in his hands for a long time before ordering anything. But that was weeks away. Now there was only the ridge, the column behind him, and the Rhine below, dark, cold, and moving at 8 feet per second toward a sea that was a very long way from Nebraska. Captain Karl Friesenhahn had counted the charges 112 times. He was not a man given to superstition, and he understood perfectly well that counting them again would not change what they were. But he was an engineer, and engineers verify. It was the habit of a profession built on the understanding that the difference between a calculation performed once and a calculation performed 3 times was sometimes the difference between a bridge that stood and a bridge that did not. He had spent his professional life on the right side of that difference. He intended to remain there. He stood on the western approach of the Ludendorff Bridge on the morning of the 26th of February, 1945, and looked at his work with the particular dissatisfaction of a craftsman who has been given inferior materials and told to produce a result that the materials cannot support. The bridge itself was remarkable. Built between 1916 and 1918, primarily by Russian prisoners of war, it carried 2 railway tracks across 325 meters of the Rhine on 3 massive stone piers. The towers on each bank rose 4 stories, built to military specification. Thick walls, firing positions on every level, demolition chambers cut into the stone of the piers during construction. The men who had built it to last. Friesenhahn, who had studied the original engineering documents, had a professional's respect for their work, and a professional's frustration with what that work now meant for his own task. The bridge was not merely large, it was, in the precise technical sense, overbuilt, constructed with structural reserves that far exceeded what the railway loads required, because the military engineers of 1916 had understood that a bridge in a war zone needed to absorb punishment and remain standing. He needed it to fall into the river. The requisition he had filed in November of 1944 had been specific: 1,300 kilograms of military-grade explosive, placed in the demolition chambers of the central pier and the 2 approach spans. The mathematics were straightforward. He had shown his calculations to his commanding officer, who had forwarded them up the chain, and somewhere in the chain they had encountered the reality of the German supply system in the winter of 1944-45, which was a system that had been consuming itself for 3 years and now operated on the logic of substitution. Give them what is available, not what is required. What arrived was 600 kilograms of donorite. Donorite was a civilian industrial explosive designed for mining and quarrying operations with a detonation force of roughly 60 to 70% of military TNT. Friesenhahn had held the delivery manifest in his hands for a long moment before setting it down. He had not said anything to the supply officer who had brought it. There was nothing useful to say. He had done the revised calculations that night, alone, and the revised calculations told him what he already knew, that 600 kilograms of donorite, placed optimally, would damage the bridge severely and might, under favorable conditions, bring down one of the approach spans. It would not reliably drop the main structure into the Rhine. He had filed a second requisition. He had received no response. Now he walked the length of the bridge in the gray February wind, checking the electrical conduits that ran through the stone piers. Conduits that had been retrofitted long after construction, running through damp stone that had been seeping mineral water for nearly 30 years. The connections were corroded. He had replaced what he could reach and sealed what he could not. The primary firing circuit ran from the detonator box on the western bank through steel conduit to the charges on the central pier. The backup circuit ran a separate route. He had a third option: manual primer cord, ignited by hand, for the case in which both electrical systems failed. 3 systems, 600 kilograms of the wrong explosive, and a bridge built by Russian prisoners who had done their work too well. He stopped near the center of the bridge and looked down at the Rhine moving beneath him. The water was dark and very cold, and entirely indifferent to his calculations. He had the sensation, standing there, that the river had been watching men make plans on its banks for a very long time and had formed no opinion about any of them. He turned and walked back to the western bank. There was one more thing he had not yet told his commanding officer. 3 weeks earlier, an Allied air raid had dropped ordnance in the vicinity of the bridge. No direct hits, the structure had survived intact. But in the subsequent inspection, he had found a section of the primary electrical conduit on the western approach that showed impact damage. The wire inside was severed. He had routed the primary circuit around the break and confirmed continuity on the backup. The system would function. He told himself this on the walk back. The system would function. On the 14th of October, 1944, an American bomb fell through the roof of the demolition chamber of the Mulheim Bridge in Cologne and triggered the charges inside. The bridge had not been ordered destroyed. No written authorization had been issued. No commanding general had signed a demolition order. The charges had been placed there months earlier as a precaution, wired and ready, waiting for the moment that everyone understood was coming, but that no one had yet formally acknowledged. The bomb made the acknowledgement unnecessary. The Mulheim Bridge settled into the Rhine in a cloud of dust and falling stone, and the report of its destruction reached Hitler's headquarters sometime that afternoon. Hitler read it twice. What followed was not a strategic assessment or a tactical review. It was the response of a man who had spent 4 years constructing a command system built entirely around his personal authority, and who had just received evidence that his system had produced an outcome without his permission. A bridge had been destroyed. No one had asked him. In his mind, these two facts were not separate problems. They were the same problem. The directive he issued within 48 hours was precise and, on its surface, reasonable. Demolition charges on Rhine bridges could only be connected to detonators at the last possible moment. The order to destroy a bridge had to come in writing from a designated authority. Any officer who destroyed a bridge without written authorization would face court-martial. Any officer who failed to destroy a bridge when ordered would face the same. The directive moved through the chain of command with the efficiency that fear produces. By November of 1944, every bridge commander on the Western Front understood the new mathematics of his position. 2 death sentences faced him, one for acting too soon, one for acting too late. The only interval between them was the written order, and the written order depended on a chain of command that was, by the winter of 1944-45, moving at the speed of retreating armies on congested roads in the dark. In the planning rooms of the Wehrmacht, there were officers who understood immediately what the directive would produce. They understood it the way engineers understand a load-bearing calculation, not as an opinion, but as a consequence that followed necessarily from the structure of the thing. A command system that required written authorization to act at the moment of unexpected contact with the enemy was not a command system designed for the speed at which the Americans were moving. It was a system designed for a war that Germany had been fighting in 1942, when the front lines were stable enough that a written order could travel from headquarters to bridge commander before the situation changed. By March of 1945, the front lines were not stable. By March of 1945, the front lines were moving at the speed of American armor on open roads, which was a speed that the written order system had not been designed to match, and could not match, and would not match, regardless of how efficiently the paperwork moved. The officers who understood this filed their assessments and received no response, because the directive had come from Hitler personally, and the Wehrmacht in the spring of 1945 had lost the institutional capacity to tell Hitler that his directives were producing the opposite of their intended effect. The directive remained in force. At every bridge on the Rhine, commanders waited for written orders, while American columns appeared on roads that intelligence summaries had reported as safely in the rear the previous morning. Some bridges were destroyed in time. The engineers stayed behind, fired the charges manually, and the structure fell into the river as intended. Some were destroyed too late, the charges going off as American infantry was already on the western approach, close enough to feel the pressure wave. And at one bridge, the last bridge, the one in the small town of Remagen, the written order arrived in the hands of a man who had been at the bridge for 90 minutes, who had no radio, and who did not know that the Americans were already coming down the hill. The directive had done exactly what the officers in the planning rooms had understood it would do. It had paralyzed the chain of command at the worst possible moment, at the worst possible place, on the last bridge standing over the Rhine. At 1 o'clock in the morning on the 7th of March, 1945, General Otto Hitzfeld sat in his headquarters 35 kilometers from Remagen and read a message that told him he was now responsible for the bridge. He had been commanding the 67th Corps for 3 weeks. In those 3 weeks, his corps had lost roughly 40% of its effective strength in the fighting along the Siegfried Line, and the remainder was spread across a front that had been designed for a force twice its size. His staff worked by lamplight because the electrical supply to the headquarters building had been unreliable since the previous Thursday. Outside, the roads were full of retreating German units moving east in the dark. Infantry companies that had started the campaign at full strength and were now down to the size of platoons. Horse-drawn artillery pieces moving at the pace of exhausted animals. The particular mixture of order and dissolution that characterized the Wehrmacht in the Rhineland in the winter of 1945. Hitzfeld read the message twice and called for his adjutant. Major Hans Scheller was 32 years old. He was a professional soldier who had served on the Eastern Front before a wound in the summer of 1943 had brought him back to staff duties in the West. He was competent, methodical, and possessed of the particular quality that staff officers develop over years of service: the ability to move quickly through unfamiliar situations without showing, on his face, the degree to which the situation exceeds what he was trained to handle. His wife Liesel was at home in Württemberg. She was expecting their 3rd child in April. Hitzfeld gave him the assignment in the language that headquarters uses for assignments it cannot afford to examine too closely. Go to Remagen. Assess the bridge situation. Take command if necessary. Report back as soon as communications permit. Scheller left at 1:30 in the morning with 8 men and a radio truck. The roads between the headquarters and Remagen were carrying the full weight of a retreating army. Columns of vehicles moved in both directions: east toward the bridge, west, away from American pressure that was closer than the map suggested. Somewhere on those roads, in the dark, the radio truck got separated from Scheller's vehicle. He did not discover this until he stopped to check his position and found that the vehicle behind him was not the one he expected. He waited 20 minutes. The radio truck did not appear. He drove on. He arrived at the Ludendorff Bridge at 11:15 in the morning. Captain Wilhelm Bratke, the designated bridge commander, was standing on the western approach when Scheller's vehicle pulled up. Bratke had been at the bridge for 2 weeks. He knew the garrison, 180 soldiers of various descriptions, including a contingent of Hitler Youth teenagers with rifles who had been assigned to him 3 days earlier by a headquarters that apparently believed that boys of 16 could compensate for the absence of trained infantry. He knew the demolition plan. He knew Friesenhahn's concerns about the explosive. And he had known since the 5th of March, when American armor had appeared on the roads west of Remagen, that the bridge needed to be destroyed immediately. He had requested authorization twice. He had received no written order. Scheller took command. He outranked Bratke, and the directive was clear. The written order was required, and the written order had to come from Hitzfeld's headquarters. And Hitzfeld's headquarters was 35 kilometers away on a radio net that Scheller could no longer reach because his radio truck was somewhere on a road between here and there. The 2 men stood on the western approach of the Ludendorff Bridge and looked at each other across the particular silence that exists between professional soldiers who understand the same situation and have reached opposite conclusions about what it requires. Bratke wanted to blow the bridge immediately, written order or no written order, and accept the court-martial if the Americans did not arrive in the next hour. Scheller wanted to wait. More German troops were still crossing. The written order was coming. The Americans could not be that close. They argued for 20 minutes. Then a runner arrived from the western edge of town with a report that American armor had been observed on the heights above Remagen, looking down at the river. Scheller looked at Bratke. Bratke said nothing. He had already said everything he had to say. Scheller sent a messenger east across the bridge to find a functioning telephone line and reach Hitzfeld's headquarters for the written order. He watched the messenger cross the bridge at a run, growing smaller against the gray sky until he disappeared into the eastern tower. Then he turned back toward the western hills, where somewhere above the tree line, American field glasses were pointed at the last bridge over the Rhine. The written order had not arrived. At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, on the 7th of March, 1945, the lead elements of Task Force Engemann reached the heights above Remagen and stopped. Timmerman was behind them by perhaps 200 meters when the column slowed and then ceased moving entirely. The particular stillness of vehicles that have encountered something unexpected. Drivers sitting with their hands on their wheels, looking at whatever the men in front of them are looking at. He climbed out of his half-track and walked forward along the column's edge, past the Shermans of the 14th Tank Battalion idling in the cold, past the faces of men who had learned over 8 months to read the significance of an unplanned halt with the accuracy of men whose lives depend on that reading. He reached the ridge and looked down. The town of Remagen sat in the valley below him, a modest Rhineland town of perhaps 5,000 people, its church spire visible above the rooftops, its streets running down toward the river in the orderly grid of a place that had been built without expectation of becoming significant. Beyond the town, the Rhine. And beyond the Rhine, connected to the western bank by 325 meters of steel and stone, the Ludendorff Bridge. It was standing. Timmerman raised his field glasses and looked at it for a long moment without speaking. German trucks were still crossing from west to east, small, dark shapes moving across the bridge's surface at the unhurried pace of men who do not yet know they are being watched. He could see the stone towers on each bank, 4 stories of military masonry that had been built in 1916 with firing positions on every level. He could see, or thought he could see, the dark shapes of demolition charges hanging from the girders beneath the roadway. He lowered the glasses. The thing that he felt standing on that ridge was not easily named. He had been a soldier long enough to have developed a reliable suspicion of anything that looked like good fortune. Because good fortune on the Western Front had a habit of revealing itself, upon closer examination, as a different kind of problem. A bridge that was still standing over the Rhine in March of 1945 was not straightforwardly good fortune. It was a bridge that the Germans had been preparing to destroy for years and had not yet destroyed. Which meant either that the destruction was imminent or that something had gone wrong with the plan. And both of those possibilities had implications that required careful thought before a man started moving his company toward them. He was thinking about this when his battalion commander appeared at his elbow. Major Murray Devers had commanded the 27th Armored Infantry Battalion since the previous autumn. He was a careful officer, not cautious in the way that produces paralysis, but careful in the way that produces plans that account for what can go wrong, which, in Timmerman's experience, was the rarer and more valuable quality. He raised his own field glasses, looked at the bridge for perhaps 30 seconds, and lowered them without speaking. Then he said, "The orders are to take the town and continue south towards Sinzig." Timmerman said nothing. Devers looked at the bridge again. Then he said, "But that bridge is standing." These were not dramatic words. They were the words of a man doing arithmetic in his head, the arithmetic of opportunity and risk, and the distance between what his orders said and what the situation in front of him was saying, which were 2 different things pointing in 2 different directions. Timmerman had heard officers perform this arithmetic before. He had seen it go both ways. He waited. Devers said, "I'm going to radio Combat Command B." He walked back toward his vehicle. Timmerman stood on the ridge and watched the German trucks crossing the bridge below him and thought about the charges hanging from the girders and the 8 feet per second of cold water running beneath them, and the fact that somewhere in the chain of command above him, men were about to make a decision that would determine whether the next order he received was to continue south toward Sinzig or to take his company across 325 meters of a bridge that the Germans had spent 4 years preparing to destroy. He thought about his 140 men. He thought about the water. He watched the bridge. The decision moved up the chain of command in 11 minutes. Devers reached Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Engelmann by radio. Engelmann had been commanding Task Force Engelmann since the previous week, a combined arms formation built around the 9th Armored Division's assets, assembled for the drive south towards Sinzig and the towns beyond it. He had not slept properly in 4 days. He listened to Devers without interrupting, then said he was coming forward. He arrived at the ridge, raised his field glasses, and looked at the bridge for perhaps 20 seconds. Then he radioed Combat Command B. Major Ben Cothine, the operations officer, arrived first. He was a lean, precise man who had the professional habit of assessing situations in silence before speaking, which meant that the ridge above Remagen was, for a brief interval, occupied by 3 American officers standing in a row looking through field glasses at a bridge that none of them had been sent here to capture. Cothine looked for perhaps 30 seconds. Then he reached for his radio. Brigadier General William Hoge arrived at the ridge at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. He was the commander of Combat Command B, and he had the authority to make the decision that the situation required. He raised his field glasses. He looked at the bridge. German troops were still crossing. Fewer now than an hour earlier, the flow thinning as the afternoon advanced. He could see the demolition charges. He could see the towers. He could see the dark water of the Rhine moving beneath 325 meters of steel that had been standing since 1918 and was, at this moment, still standing. He lowered his glasses. He said, "Take that bridge." The words were spoken quietly, in the tone of a man stating a conclusion he reached 30 seconds ago. He said them to Engelmann, who turned immediately toward Devers, who was already moving toward Timmerman. Hoge stood on the ridge a moment longer, looking at the bridge, understanding with the clarity that comes to commanders at decisive moments that he had just violated his assigned orders. His directive was to continue south toward Arweiler, not to assault a Rhine crossing, and that the violation was correct, and that he would account for it later, if later arrived. Engelmann had already given Timmerman the order before Hoge finished speaking. Timmerman received it on the slope below the ridge, where he had positioned himself to watch the town. Devers came down the slope at a pace that communicated urgency without running, which was the pace of officers who have learned that running produces panic in the men watching them. He stopped beside Timmerman and said, "The general wants you to take your company across that bridge." Timmerman looked at him. Devers said, "Do you think you can get your company across?" Timmerman looked down at the bridge. He looked at the charges he could see hanging from the girders. He looked at the towers with their firing positions, and the dark water beneath the span, and the eastern bank where German soldiers were visible moving between buildings. He performed the arithmetic that the situation required. Not the arithmetic of probability or of risk assessment, but the simpler arithmetic of a man who has been given an order and is deciding whether it is the kind of order that can be executed. He said, "Well, we can try it, sir." Then he asked, "What if the bridge blows up in my face?" Devers did not answer. There was no answer that added anything useful to the situation. Timmerman had not asked the question because he expected an answer. He had asked it because it was the honest question, the one that named the central fact of what he was being asked to do. And he was the kind of man who named central facts, rather than leaving them unspoken in the space between an order and its execution. He turned toward his company. The Pershing tanks of the 14th Tank Battalion were already moving into firing positions on the heights above the town, their 90-millimeter guns traversing toward the eastern tower, toward the far bank, toward the locomotive visible on the railway siding beyond the bridge. White phosphorus smoke rounds began falling on the western approach, laying a screen across the bridge's surface that drifted east in the afternoon wind. The noise of the tank's engines and the first ranging shots from the heights filled the valley with the particular sound of a battle beginning. Not the sudden eruption of contact, but the deliberate build of a prepared assault, each element moving into position with the mechanical logic of men who have done this before. Timmerman briefed his platoon leaders in 2 minutes. There was not time for more. First platoon on the northern catwalk. Second platoon down the center. Engineers from Lieutenant Hugh Mott's platoon immediately behind the infantry. Their job was to cut every wire they could see and throw every undetonated charge they could reach into the Rhine. Third platoon in reserve on the western approach, moving forward as the situation developed. He looked at his men. They looked back at him with the expressions of men who have been soldiers long enough to have stopped being surprised by the things they are asked to do, but who have not yet stopped being afraid of them. Because the fear was the part that kept you moving correctly, and the veterans knew this even if they could not have articulated it. Timmerman said, "We go on my signal." He looked at his watch. It was 3:45 in the afternoon. At 3:50 in the afternoon, Timmerman raised his hand and dropped it. His men moved. They came off the western approach in the ordered spread of infantry that has been trained to present the smallest possible target while maintaining the momentum that training produces. Not a charge, not a rush, but the deliberate controlled movement of men who understand that stopping is more dangerous than moving, and that the only protection available on 325 meters of open bridge is velocity. The smoke from the white phosphorus rounds drifted across the surface in gray-white curtains that opened and closed with the river wind, giving the men on the bridge intermittent cover and intermittent exposure in alternation that could not be predicted or used, only endured. Through the smoke, the eastern tower was visible at intervals. 4 stories of military masonry 200 meters away and closing, its firing slits alive with the muzzle flash of machine guns that traversed slowly across the bridge surface with the mechanical patience of weapons operated by men who do not need to hurry because the target is not going anywhere. Bullets struck the steel girders and the bridge planking with sounds that had no analogy in civilian life. A hard, flat crack distinct from the sound of the weapon that produced them, arriving slightly before the mind could process their origin, so that a man's body flinched before his consciousness understood why. Private First Class Marvin Jensen, 20 years old, from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, was hit on the northern catwalk 30 meters from the western approach. He went down and did not get up. The men behind him stepped around him and kept moving, because stopping meant dying, and the bridge offered nothing between a man and the fire coming from the tower, except the distance he could cover before the next burst found him. Timmerman was moving down the center of the bridge with his second platoon, his carbine in his hands, watching the tower and watching his men and watching the charges hanging from the girders beneath the roadway. Dark cylindrical shapes connected by wire that ran along the underside of the span in loops that swayed slightly in the wind off the river. Behind him, Lieutenant Mott's engineers were cutting. They worked with wire cutters and with their hands, severing every connection they could reach, dropping charges into the Rhine 60 feet below, the splash inaudible beneath the noise of the firefight, the dark water closing over each package with indifference. Then the large charge detonated. Friesenhahn, on the western bank, had received the order and pressed the electrical switch. The primary circuit had failed. The severed cable, the one he had routed around 3 weeks ago, had failed again at a connection he had not been able to inspect since the air raid. He had switched to the backup without hesitation, the movement of a man who has rehearsed the contingency until it requires no thought. The backup circuit fired. The explosion was enormous. Every man on the bridge felt it before he heard it. A pressure wave that moved up through the soles of the boots and through the steel of the bridge deck and through the chest cavity with a force that was not pain exactly, but the physical announcement of a very large amount of energy being released in a confined space. The bridge seemed to rise, a collective upward movement of 325 meters of steel and stone that lasted perhaps half a second, and then it settled. It settled back onto its piers. The donorite had blown a 6-inch sag into the main span. It had shattered planking across a 30-meter section near the center. It had bent steel in ways that would matter to an engineer examining the structure later, in the quiet of the aftermath, with instruments and time. It had not dropped the bridge into the Rhine. The Russian prisoners of war who had built those piers in 1916 and 1917 had built them to carry the weight of military trains, and 600 kilograms of civilian mining explosive, placed suboptimally in demolition chambers designed for 1,300 kilograms of military-grade material, had encountered the physics of that construction and lost. The bridge was standing. Timmerman looked up from where the pressure wave had put him, one knee on the bridge deck, one hand on a girder, and saw the eastern tower 200 meters away, and his men still moving, and the smoke still drifting, and the machine guns in the tower still firing. He stood up. He kept moving. Sergeant Alexander Drabik, former butcher from Holland, Ohio, was ahead of him on the center span, running with the particular stride of a tall man who has decided that the fastest way across is the only way across. He was not zigzagging. He was not using cover, because there was no cover. He had made the calculation that Timmerman had made, and that every man still moving on that bridge had made. The velocity was the only protection available, and that the way to use it was to use all of it, without reservation, without looking at anything except the eastern bank getting closer with each stride. His squad was behind him in column. They ran. Sergeant Joe DeLessio reached the eastern tower first. He was from New York City, and he had the particular quality of certain city-raised men who move through confined spaces with an instinctive economy that open countrymen have to learn deliberately. He covered the last 50 meters to the tower entrance at a dead run, alone, under direct fire from the firing slit above the doorway, and threw himself through the opening with the momentum of a man who is committed entirely to a direction and has nothing left to spend on hesitation. Inside the tower, a German crew was operating a machine gun through the firing slit. DeLessio subdued them. He was later asked what he had been thinking. He said, "I wasn't thinking, I was moving." Drabik reached the eastern bank at approximately 4 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. His squad was behind him, all of them, not one man hit in the final sprint across the last 100 meters of open bridge. He stepped off the bridge ramp onto German soil and kept moving, because stopping was not a reflex he had available at that moment. His body had been running on the logic of forward motion for 11 minutes and required another 30 seconds to understand that the eastern bank was under his boots and that the Rhine was behind him. He was the first American soldier to cross the Rhine since Napoleon. He did not know this. He was looking for cover. The eastern bank was not secure. It was not close to secure. Drabik's squad was 75 men on the wrong side of the Rhine, with no armor, no artillery support, and the steep face of the Erpeler Lay, a basalt cliff rising directly behind the bridge, limiting their ability to move inland. German soldiers were visible in the streets of Erpel above them. Fire was coming from multiple directions. The bridge behind them was still being crossed by men who were still being shot at, and the engineers behind those men were still cutting wires and throwing charges into the river, and the machine guns in the eastern tower had been silenced, but the guns on the far ridges had not. Timmerman crossed at 4:12 in the afternoon. He stepped onto the eastern bank and immediately began organizing the perimeter with the focused attention of a man who has stopped performing one task and started performing the next without interval. Sectors of fire, fields of observation, the cliff face to the east and the streets of Erpel above. He moved among his men with the particular authority of an officer who is afraid and is using the fear correctly, not suppressing it, not showing it, but running it through the machinery of training until it came out as decision. Beneath the bridge, in a tunnel bored through the basalt of the Erpeler Lay, approximately 500 German soldiers were waiting. Friesenhahn was among them. Brodka was among them. The tunnel also contained civilians, residents of Erpel who had taken shelter there when the fighting began. Women and children and old men sitting in the dark with the sounds of the battle filtering through the stone above them. The tunnel had been wired with explosives. A detonation would have collapsed the cliff face onto the eastern end of the bridge, sealing the crossing as effectively as dropping the bridge itself. Nobody gave the order. The written authorization had not arrived. Scheller was on the western bank, cut off from his headquarters, unable to reach Hitzfeld by radio. The officers in the tunnel who had the physical ability to trigger the charges did not have the written authority to do so. And the directive from October of 1944 was still in force, and the Wehrmacht in March of 1945 was still a system that shot men for acting without written authorization. And so the charges in the tunnel sat connected to their detonators, while 75 American soldiers organized a perimeter 30 meters away. Friesenhahn sat in the tunnel with his back against the stone wall and listened to the sounds of the battle diminishing as the American bridgehead consolidated. He was a professional military engineer who had done everything within his power and had been failed by insufficient explosive, corroded wiring, and a command system that had paralyzed itself at the moment action was required. He had run the calculations correctly. He had filed the requisitions. He had maintained 3 separate detonation systems. He had done the work. The bridge was standing. At approximately 5:30 in the afternoon, Timmerman's men reached the tunnel entrance and called for surrender. After a long moment, the first German soldiers emerged with their hands raised, blinking in the gray afternoon light. Then more. Then Bratke. Then Friesenhahn, who walked out of the tunnel and stood on the eastern bank of the Rhine and looked at the bridge he had spent months preparing to destroy, still spanning the river in the fading light, and said nothing. By 6 o'clock in the evening, the number of American soldiers on the eastern bank was in the hundreds. The engineers were still cutting cables in the dark, working by the light of hand torches, dropping the last undetonated charges into the Rhine. The water closed over each one without ceremony. The river ran cold and fast beneath the bridge, indifferent as it had always been, carrying whatever was given to it eastward toward a sea that was a long way from Nebraska, and a long way from Württemberg, and a long way from Holland, Ohio. 325 meters of bridge were standing over the Rhine. The last wall had a door in it. Lieutenant General Rudolf Hübner arrived at his assignment with no law books and no intention of needing them. Hitler had appointed him personally. The order was simple: find the guilty, try them, execute them. Hübner had been described in his own confidential Wehrmacht personnel file as a man of unhealthy ambition, which was precisely the quality the assignment required. When the legal officer of Army Group B offered him a copy of the German Military Code of Justice on the 11th of March, Hübner waved it aside. He told the officer that the only authority he needed was Hitler's personal directive. The trials lasted hours. The outcomes had been decided before the defendants entered the room. 5 officers were charged: Major Hans Scheller, Major Herbert Strobe, Major August Kraft, Lieutenant Karl-Heinz Peters, Captain Wilhelm Bratke. Friesenhahn was tried and acquitted. The tribunal found that he had done everything within his power, that the failure of the demolition was attributable to factors outside his control. He walked out. The others did not. Scheller was convicted of cowardice and dereliction of duty. The tribunal did not address the severed cable, the insufficient explosive, the radio truck lost on a dark road, or the directive from October of 1944 that had made his position impossible from the moment he accepted it. These were not the facts the tribunal had been assembled to consider. He was allowed to write a letter to his wife Liesel. The letter was burned before it left the building. On the 14th of March 1945, 7 days after the bridge fell, Major Hans Scheller was shot in the back of the neck and buried in a shallow grave in the Westerwald forest. He was 32 years old. His wife was expecting their 3rd child in April. Peters, Strobe, and Kraft were executed the same day. 4 men shot for the mathematical consequence of a Hitler directive, a civilian explosive compound, and 16 hours of command chaos on a road in the Rhineland. The system that had created every condition of the failure turned and shot the men who had lived inside it. The Ludendorff Bridge fell on the 17th of March 1945, not from German attack. from the weight of what had crossed it. 25,000 soldiers, hundreds of vehicles, thousands of tons of supplies moving across a structure damaged by partial demolition, 10 days of artillery, 11 V-2 rockets, 367 aircraft sorties, frogmen with limpet mines, and a 600mm siege mortar fired from a railway car. None of these destroyed it. The bridge fell because the Russian prisoners who built it in 1916 had not built it for this. It killed 28 American engineers working on its surface when it went down. By then, it no longer mattered. 2 pontoon bridges stood alongside it. 125,000 soldiers had crossed. The Ruhr was encircled on the 1st of April. On the 18th, 325,000 German soldiers surrendered, the largest mass capitulation on the Western Front in the entire war. Eisenhower estimated that Remagen had shortened the war in Europe by 6 months. Carl Timmerman came home to West Point, Nebraska. He read about his daughter in a Paris cafe weeks after the crossing in a copy of Stars and Stripes. He sat with the newspaper in his hands for a long time. Her name was Gay Diane. She had been born 8 days before he crossed the bridge, 90 miles from the city where he himself had been born 22 years earlier. He became a salesman. He missed the army and re-enlisted. He fought in Korea and was awarded a 2nd Distinguished Service Cross. He contracted cancer. He died on the 21st of October, 1951, at the age of 29 at Fort Logan National Cemetery in Colorado. He never read what Eisenhower wrote about what his men had accomplished. He never stood on the bridge again. By the time he came home on leave, it was already at the bottom of the Rhine. The 2 stone towers still stand at Remagen today. They house a peace museum. The men who built them in 1916 designed them as military fortifications. The men who crossed between them in 11 minutes were never supposed to be there. They had been given orders pointing south toward Sinzig, toward objectives that history has since forgotten entirely. What they found instead was the last bridge over the last river, and they ran across it because running was the only logical move available, and because the man in front of them was running, and because stopping meant dying alone. Drabik went home to Holland, Ohio. Friesenhahn wrote his memoirs. He described 120 aircraft types, the tolerances of captured engines, the philosophy of enemy manufacturing. A professional's account, precise and almost entirely free of self-pity. He received no official acknowledgement that his reports had been accurate or that his demolition had failed through no fault of his own. He had done the work correctly. The system had failed him. He recorded this without complaint, in the language of an engineer, and let the mathematics speak for itself. The Rhine runs cold beneath the empty towers. It ran the same way on the 7th of March, 1945, carrying whatever was given to it eastward. Undetonated charges, cut wire, the debris of a battle that lasted 11 minutes and shortened a war by 6 months. It did not notice. It had been running through that valley since before the Romans, and it would run long after the last man who crossed the Ludendorff Bridge had been buried and forgotten. The bridge is gone. The river remains.